The hills and valleys of Africa carry deep within them the truths about the centuries of people who walked this land. But the earth doesn't give up her secrets easily. It takes patience and resolve to open the soil to find the treasures that lie beneath the surface. The Zulu women sing their songs and sharpen their blades as they prepare the land for investigation. The earth is ready to be peeled back, and the truths that inhabit the layers within it to be found by those who look to answer the questions. Who are we? When did we get here? How did we live? This is a story of discovery. This story begins in a classroom at the University of Natal in Durban, where Professor Jeff Guy introduces the students to the myth of South African origins. Under apartheid, the story of our history was shaped by political influences, going so far as to claim that white settlers appeared on South African soil at the same time as black Africans. This myth, used as the foundation of white power and control, is clearly presented in the textbooks of apartheid.
Look at this book. The official yearbook of the Republic of South Africa of 1974. There's a section here called The History of Black Settlement. This is what it says. Prior to their southward migration, the forebears of the present Bantu groups used to live in the region of the Great Lakes of Central Africa. Their entry into what is today South Africa roughly coincided with the arrival of the first European settlers at the Cape in 1652. This epochal influx, in many respects comparable to the migratory convulsions of the barbarians of Roman times, was the culmination of a century-old southwards movement which was primarily caused by the push and pull function of economic forces and/or tribal clashes. End of quotation. Now here we have an example of the sort of history put forward in the 1970s in an attempt to legitimate apartheid ideology. Look at this map. Africans here are called Bantu. It is asserted they did not originate in South Africa any more than Europeans did. The Europeans as part of the process of colonial settlement, and the Africans as the result of this migratory convulsion. And they all arrived at about the same time in the middle of the 17th century. By the 20th century, the yearbook continues, the nuclei of the various ethnic groups retained their traditional tribal areas. Today, these are known as the Bantu homelands, unquote. So here we have history of origins and beginnings, abused, turned into propaganda, apartheid propaganda.
The argument over the timing of origins must be settled with real evidence of when different people inhabited South Africa, and that evidence is supplied by early farmers. Farming created sedentary societies where people settled and lived in the same place for long periods, leaving behind the clues of their existence.
That's one of the very fundamental questions we have to answer is, when did farming come to South Africa? And of course this means looking for the first signs of farming. The seeds of domesticated plants, the sorghums, the millets, the clay pots in which the food was carried, the stones which were used to grind the cereals, for the pits in which the grains were stored, for signs of domesticated animals, for the bones of cattle, of sheep and goats. We must also look for the distinguishing feature of South Africa's first farmers, metals. For unlike the Stone Age hunting people, the first African farmers used iron. And it is for these that we have to search if we are to find the roots of African culture. And to do this, we turn to the discipline of archaeology.
It is morning in the Tugela Valley, a place tucked neatly into the northern reaches of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Guy and his students have come to find the treasures waiting for them deep in the earth. left centuries ago by the communities of black African farmers who settled this region. From his campsite hugging the riverbank, Professor Guy orients us to the features of the surrounding land.
This is the Tugela River on the borders of historic Natal and the Zulu Kingdom. We're about 90 kilometers from the sea, about 200 meters above sea level, so it's a very deeply cut valley. The vegetation is valley bush veld. It's very hot here in the summer, dry. Winters, the nights are cold, it heats up during the day. This is typical of the sort of environment that was used by the first farming communities in this region. And that's why we've come to this campsite to explore some of the remains on the banks of the river.
The students make their way from the campground to the dig site, where Leonard van Schalkwyk introduces them to the technical necessities of archaeology. First, the entire site must be mapped out in a grid system in order to monitor and record any and all discoveries made here.
The macro grid over the site is centered on 00 into 4 sectors. Obviously, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. Each sector is divided into 20-meter blocks. And we work off those 20-meter blocks downwards. The reason that grid is laid out is that archaeologists, I think, are about the only scientists who systematically destroy their own database as they proceed with their work. And the consequence of that is that you have to record everything in the finest detail. It's provenience and location by a set of coordinates. In other words, you want to know where it is on the X and the Y axis, and you also want to know on the Z axis how deep or how high it is above the ground. You've got to take that data afterwards and rework it into writing up an explanation of what you, as the research worker, believes is going on site. And hence the grid.
The physical layout of the site into a grid allows the archaeologists and their students to now begin the search for cultural artifacts. But digging, the activity we usually associate with archaeology, must wait. The second phase of the process is now introduced: reconnaissance of the site. Surface scatter analyses, soil conductivity surveys, and digging core samples are all used to find the places most likely to yield remnants from the past.
Surface scatter analysis. And what you're going to do is you're going to walk down each line, and on a meter on either side of the line roughly, you're going to pick up alternate squares. You're going to systematically move down here, then move it over to the next 20-meter block, and systematically work through to the end of the field. All right? It may seem to be mundane and almost a pointless exercise, but what this does allow us to do is either determine whether we've got a significant concentration of surface material, or if we only have a random scatter. The other thing to look out for is bits of pottery, daga, which is burnt daub, burnt clay, baked clay, and grindstones, upper and lower grindstones. Possibly even some bone might be coming up. There's bone coming out of the plow horizon, okay? You pop that in the bag. Alright.
The search continues for bits and pieces that have made their way to the surface, but the real find lies beneath the earth. To assist the archaeologists in finding the hidden artifacts, a test is conducted to measure the electrical conductivity of the soil. Our third host at the site, Haskel Greenfield, explains.
The amount of resistance that certain soils have or certain deposits have and how fast it will conduct indicates where we get changes in deposits. So, for example, when you go to a very, when you hit a wall, a stone wall or a daga wall, the conductivity will be low and the resistance will be high. so that we can actually begin to sense where features and structures might be.
So we have to take now a reading to do the control, so we can find out. And I'll log it in on here.
Okay.
That's the ring.
The scatter analysis and electrical conductivity measure indicates where there might be something under the ground, but the soil itself holds clues to what lies beneath. The third test, digging core samples, provides the archaeologist with even more information about what might still be buried, awaiting discovery.
One of the techniques that we use to try and ascertain whether we've got subterranean features, and that is to do a systematic coring over the site with a soil auger, and we're able to read the soil profile in what comes out in the auger, and hopefully indicate to us whether we're going to be striking features or other concentrations of cultural material.
Good.
Look here, from about here, there's a gradual change in soil color.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And here's the
that's
last
very
one I've
different.
just taken up. And this,
Going to the bed.
this is sterile base.
The reason that we use techniques like systematic surface collection, like conductivity surveying, like coring, is because it's essentially to investigate an archaeological site of this size and scale is very difficult to do it only by excavation. Excavation is extremely time consuming, it's expensive, and it's difficult.
But excavation, the third phase of the archaeological process, is about to start. The students finally get to be the archaeologists they thought they would be. They dig, and they dig, and they dig some more.
The largest part of field archaeology is boring excavation. You've got to get the overburden away. It's part of the process. And you know, even us with years of field experience understand that there is that rote and boring aspect to the work. The excitement comes when the material starts to come up from below, and I think we hit that. But the goodies are coming up now.
Soon the digging begins to uncover objects on the floor of the carefully constructed pits. But now the puzzle of the past becomes one of the present. What have they found? When was it put here, and what does it all mean? To answer these questions, the science of archaeology takes over from the labor of the investigation. In order to determine how old are the artifacts found in the excavation, 3 conceptual tools are used: stratigraphy, carbon dating, and dissociation.
Archaeology works on the basic principle of stratigraphy. Stratigraphy essentially says that over time deposits will be built up, and as the conditions that create those soil deposits change, the colors, the textures will also change, and this enables us to be able to separate out different deposits, or what we call strata, horizons. You can see that quite clearly in here on this wall. Quite simply, it goes from much more sandy type of loam here to a more clayey type of loam here. And you can actually see that quite nicely because you can see the sand granules mixed in with the sediments here. And there's no sand granules almost down here. You can feel that as you pull it together. And you can see here, you can see the mica and the sand here. And as you squeeze it, this one crumbles, and as you squeeze this, it binds slightly together. So we can also begin to date each of the deposits. It's not only a matter of knowing that the upper one is younger than the lower one, or the lower one is older than the upper one. We want to know when they were deposited as well. And we can do that by what we call the law of association. We know the pot is in the cultural horizon. If we find near it, or somewhere else in this larger cultural horizon, a piece of bone or burnt wood that we can then radiocarbon date, and we can date the horizon, the pot by association. Because it's found in the same horizon, becomes dated to that same time period. Association is everything. This is why archaeologists get very upset when people disturb archaeological sites, take the material culture out of the sites, and then try and simply put it into museums without any association, because we don't know where it come from, we can't date it, and it becomes useless and it becomes lost to the cultural heritage of the people.
But how on earth are you going to date something that's found down there at the bottom?
The way we date prehistoric material before you have things like coins or documents is through a technique called radiocarbon dating, or C14 dating. And C14 dating enables us to assign an actual date or a series of dates based upon the radioactive disintegration of isotopes in certain objects to a particular period of time.
So the archaeological tools of stratigraphy, carbon dating and association lead to understanding the approximate age of artifacts found in any excavation. But what about this site?
What people like Tim Maggs did in the late 70s and 80s is they built up a ceramic sequence that is radiocarbon anchored. Yeah. All right. Well, basically what that means is the number of sites that we've dug, and Msuluzi and Donondwan and Chekan are the names of sites that then gave their names to the pottery phase. We have firm radiocarbon dates on those. It's been substantiated by radiocarbon dates from a number of other sites, which means that if I do a site survey here now, I come on a site, I can recognize the pottery and I know the time frame that it falls in. And Msuluzi is running roughly from 500 to 700.
500?
Yeah. And Donondwan 700 to 900, and in Chekan phase from 900 to 1100. Those are quite gross breakdowns, but it's roughly that 150 to 200 years.
So that house we're dealing with the 7 centuries floor.
Yeah.
Leonard van Schalkwyk explains how the pottery in particular becomes a valuable clue in determining when exactly black farmers lived in this part of South Africa.
Ceramics or pottery is probably probably the most durable cultural residue left on early Iron Age sites. We were able to reconstruct vessels such as we have here, and what archaeologists have over the last 20 years been able to do is to draw up a cultural historic sequence for the early Iron Age based on pottery design and pottery form. We have here examples of the earliest phase of the early Iron Age in the river valleys. This is not the coastal phase, named Msuluzi, characterized by decoration right through the neck of the vessel and onto the body. In Donondwan phase pottery, which is characterized usually by a clean neck and then a band of decoration at the body neck junction. And then the later phase in Chekan, where you see that a far more pronounced neck and increased neck decoration. Roughly these phases date from 500 AD to about 700 AD for the Msuluzi phase, 7 to 900 AD for the Ndondondwan phase, and 900 to 1100 AD for the Chekan phase. These phases are named after the sites where they were first found, and the significance again of Ndondondwan is that archaeologists recognized a new phase within the culture sequence of the early Iron Age in the province.
But what does all of this tell us about when the early inhabitants of the Tugela Valley arrived? Professor Guy leads us through the final and most important stage of archaeology, interpretation. Back at the campsite, all of the students' efforts of gridding, reconnaissance and excavation are given context and meaning.
This whiteboard represents 2,000 years of time, from the present to roughly 0 AD. This line here is halfway across, about 1,000 years ago. What we're looking at in the early Iron Age is roughly from 200 AD to, shall we say, 1100. Here I've put these little marks so you can get an idea of the sweep. So this is where we have Jan van Riebeck and the arrival of whites. Well above the early Iron Age and here present time. So, I mean, that's not to say that's all that's happening, of course, in Southern Africa. We have late Stone Age people, we have hunting and gathering people living together, perhaps conflicting, perhaps harmoniously. But this is this EIA, the early Iron Age, occupying nearly 1,000 years. I've written various phases. This is what archaeologists, this is how they divided the different sites, largely according to pottery type. Mzunjani, just out of Durban, the Mshlanga, dated to about the 3rd century AD. This long Msuluzi here about the 4th and 5th century. In Chekani about the 9th century. And here at about 750